All right, so ready to get a little bit deeper into Indian state governments.
Deeper than you might want to sometimes.
Well, more specifically, we're going to be looking at the Council of Ministers.
Yeah.
And I think whether you're, somebody who's studying for the UPSC or maybe aiming for a state PSC, or you're just, a regular person who wants to kind of understand how this stuff works.
This is the deep dive for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you got your articles, you got your notes, you got all those things.
Hopefully.
Awesome.
Let's do it.
Let's jump right in. Now, I think what's interesting is, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Indian state government, in a lot of ways, mirrors that parliamentary system that's happening at the union level, right?
Yeah, it's designed that way very intentionally. So there's a lot of parallels, but there are some very specific things about states, and especially when we look at the Council of Ministers.
And that's where we're going to kind of dive in today.
Right.
So where do we even begin? I know if I'm looking at my notes, I've got all these articles highlighted, 163, 164, and so on and so forth. What do those tell us?
Well, those are really the framework. We can think about them as rules, but really they set the stage for what becomes a power struggle. Right. Who gets to be ministering? What are the limits of those ministers? It's all kind of laid out in those articles in the Constitution.
So it's the rule book, but it's also like the battleground in some ways for how power is going to play out in a specific state.
Exactly. And one of the things that we see that is most important and often misunderstood is this idea of the Council of Ministers aiding and advising the governor.
The governor. Now, the governor is appointed by the president, but often seen as kind of an extension of the central government. So that relationship there with the council can be a little bit interesting.
It can be very interesting. There's a confidentiality built into it.
Mm-hmm.
The governor also has these discretionary powers, meaning they can act on their own in certain situations. So this isn't just the council giving orders. It's a two-way street.
So there's a balance of power, a little bit of a tug of war happening there potentially.
At least the potential.
And then to make things even more complex, I know going back to my notes, that the Supreme Court even weighed in on this whole council business, right?
You have. So it gets even more complicated because the Supreme Court has weighed in and said that the Council of Ministers has to exist at all times, even when the assembly is dissolved or even when the council resigns. You have to have a Council of Ministers. Think about what happens if you don't.
Chaos, yeah.
Exactly. And so this ensures some continuity.
It prevents a power vacuum. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we know the council always has to be there. But how does it come to be in the first place? Who picks these ministers?
So the chief minister, they're really the ones that are choosing.
So they're handpicking their team.
Yeah. Now, they don't have completely, open range to do whatever they want. So, for instance, if you're in states like Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Odisha, you have to have a tribal welfare minister. That is something that is required.
This is where it starts to get really interesting because you've got these states with large tribal populations, and they're saying, look, we need to be represented at that level.
Right.
But has that actually, having that dedicated minister, has that translated into better policies? I feel like that's a whole other debate that we could have.
It's a very valid point.
Yeah.
And for those people who are interested in, how representation translates to on-the-ground impact.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, within the council itself, we've got different tiers of minister. Correct?
Yeah.
So what does that look like?
So, think about it kind of like a company, You got your C-suite, you got your mid-level managers, you've got your entry level.
Got it.
Cabinet ministers are at the top, heading key departments, making major policy decisions.
Okay. So those are the big players. They are shaping the direction of the state government.
Yeah.
Then you've got the ministers of state.
Yeah.
What do they do?
So those are more kind of like middle management, I guess. They might have independent charge of smaller departments or assist cabinet ministers in those larger ones. It kind of depends on the state, the specific setup.
And then lastly, we've got deputy ministers. Are they kind of like the support staff?
Yeah, you could say that. They assist the cabinet ministers with administrative and parliamentary duties, really kind of learning the ropes, supporting the overall function.
Okay, so we've got our players on the field. We kind of know how they're chosen. We kind of know what level they're playing at. But what about the commitments they're making once they're actually in office?
Well, first and foremost, you have the oaths of office and secrecy. They're swearing allegiance to the Constitution, promising to serve the people. These oaths are meant to underscore the seriousness, They're not just clocking in and out.
It's a reminder that they're accountable, not just to the people maybe above them, but the citizens they represent.
Right.
Now, and speaking of accountability, we've got this kind of interesting duality with the council. We talk about this idea of a collective responsibility and an individual responsibility.
Yeah. And that's important because the whole council is answerable to the Legislative Assembly.
Okay,
That's the collective part.
got it.
So, if the Assembly passes a no confidence motion, the entire council has to resign.
Whoa, stakes are high.
Stakes are very high.
So they got to work together,
Right.
or everyone goes down.
Right.
But then what about on an individual level? How does that accountability play out?
Well, if a minister's not performing well, if they disagree with a cabinet decision, the chief minister can ask them to resign, or they can advise the governor to dismiss them. It's a balancing act,
So it's teamwork, but there are individual consequences.
Exactly.
Now, within this whole structure, this council, there's one part that seems particularly powerful, and that's the cabinet.
The cabinet is really the inner circle, right? They are the core decision-making body. Think of it like the executive board. They set policies, they manage crises, they advise the governor. They really are the ones driving the direction of the government.
Okay. So that makes sense. That's where all the big decisions are being made. But how do they even tackle all of that? Do they just all sit in one giant room and just hash it out?
Well, sometimes, but more often they have these things called cabinet committees.
Cabinet committees.
Yeah. And think of them like little task forces, right?
Yeah.
So they're smaller teams within the larger group. They delve into a specific issue, and then they prepare recommendations for the full cabinet to consider.
So it's a way to divide and conquer, I guess,
Right.
to kind of streamline that whole decision-making process. Are these committees permanent fixtures?
So some of them are. Those are called standing committees. But then they can also create these ad hoc committees, depending on what's happening at that time. So their numbers, their names, even who's on them can change over time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of flexibility built into the system,
Right.
which makes sense, I guess, when we think about how dynamic the political landscape can be.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be. And it allows the cabinet to kind of, be a little more nimble, adapt to whatever challenges come their way. But we've been talking about these kind of formal structures, committees, appointments, all that. Let's be real, the textbook version is only part of the story.
Right. There's always that behind-the-scenes stuff. Like, what are the informal influences that can really shake things up?
Yeah.
Like, I always think about that saying, politics is the art of the possible.
Yeah,
What's possible is shaped by the forces we don't always see.
precisely. So let's pull back the curtain a little bit. Let's look at some of these informal power dynamics. Think about the political landscape of any given state. You've got different parties, you've got alliances, you've got compromises being made. It's like a big game of chess where every move can impact the Council of Ministers and the decisions that they make.
So it's not just about following the rules. It's about navigating these political relationships. And the chief minister, being the head of the ruling party or the coalition, they're kind of like the grandmaster in this game.
Exactly. They have to keep their allies happy, which often means, making deals, offering positions in the council, pushing certain policies. It's all about maintaining that very delicate balance of power. And then always remember that there's always that next election looming.
Right. So even those formal appointments that we talked about, it's not always just about merit or experience. There's a political angle there, too. But it's not just internal politics at play here, right? We can't forget about the citizens, the voters.
Oh, public opinion is huge.
Yeah.
Especially, in today's age with social media. I mean, the Council of Ministers, they can't just ignore what people are saying, the demands, the criticisms, all of it.
They're constantly under a microscope. Every decision scrutinized and debated online. I imagine that puts a lot of pressure on them. How do they even keep up?
Well, a lot of state governments are turning to data, They're using surveys, polls, even social media analysis to kind of gauge public sentiment. They need to know, what are people thinking, what are their concerns, and then how do they adjust their approach accordingly?
So it's a two-way street. They've got to be responsive to public pressure, but then they also have to kind of shape public opinion as well, communicate their policies effectively, highlight their achievements, like a constant dance between governing and campaigning.
It really is. And then, of course, you throw the media into the mix, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they play a huge role in shaping public perception, in holding the government accountable.
Right. The media, that powerful watchdog, exposing corruption, highlighting issues, giving a platform to dissenting voices. I'm guessing the Council of Ministers pays very close attention to what's being said about them in the press.
They absolutely do. They
Yeah.
have whole teams dedicated to, managing their image in the media, crafting press releases, trying to control the narrative around their policies.
It's like a whole PR game,
It is. It is.
trying to put their best foot forward.
Right.
But it's not just the media and the public they have to worry about, right? You've got all these interest groups, you've got NGOs, think tanks. They all have their own agendas and can really apply pressure to the council.
You're absolutely right. It's not just the politicians and the journalists that are calling the shots here, right? You have this whole ecosystem of actors that are influencing the decision-making process. And to really understand how state governments function, you have to understand this complex web of relationships and power dynamics.
It's like all these invisible strings being pulled, like a backroom deals being made. And sometimes it feels like even those formal structures we talked about earlier, they're almost secondary to these informal forces.
It can definitely feel that way. And, going back to those discretionary powers of the governor that we mentioned earlier, they add yet another layer of complexity to this whole equation.
Right, because it's not always clear-cut who has the final say, especially in those gray areas where the governor's own personal judgment comes into play.
Exactly. I mean, think about, for instance, you have a hung assembly after an election.
Okay.
The governor's decision on who to invite to form the government can be extremely controversial.
Because there's no rule book for that. There's no formula.
Precisely. And so, their decision might be based on their own political leanings, their assessment of the different parties, maybe even pressure from the central government. Who knows?
Wow. So there's a lot at stake in those situations.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how even in a system with, pretty well-defined rules, there's always room for interpretation, for individual discretion to kind of come in and change the game.
Well, that's politics, right? I mean, it's dynamic, it's messy, it's constantly evolving. But by understanding both the formal structures and the informal forces at play, I think we can start to see the bigger picture and maybe make a little bit of sense of it all.
This has been eye-opening. We've gone from like the very basic building blocks of the Council of Ministers to all these behind-the-scenes machinations that really shape how things work. But there's one crucial element we haven't talked about yet, and that's the money. How does that impact the decisions of the Council of Ministers?
Yes. Money, the lifeblood of any government. Without it, policies are just words on paper.
Right.
So understanding how state governments get their money and how they spend it, that's crucial to understanding how they actually function.
So let's follow the money trail. Where do these funds come from in the first place?
It is, isn't it? I mean, without resources, all those policies we were talking about, they're just empty promises. So yeah, understanding where that money comes from, where it goes, that's essential.
So let's follow that money trail. Where do state governments actually get their funding from?
Well, it's a mix, really. A big chunk comes from what's called the state's own tax revenue.
Okay.
So think about sales tax, property tax, vehicle registration fees, even entertainment tax sometimes. Basically, the state collecting money from its own economic activity.
Okay. So that's the state kind of pulling itself up by its bootstraps in a way. But I imagine that's not always enough, especially for states that might be struggling economically.
Right. And that's where the grants from the central government come in. It's a system of resource sharing meant to kind of ensure some level of parity between the states.
That's interesting. So you've got this flow of funds from the union to the states. Are those grants always earmarked for specific projects, or do states have a little bit of flexibility in how they use them?
It varies. I mean, some grants are very, very specific, tied to certain programs like infrastructure development or social welfare schemes, things like that.
Okay.
But others are given for general purposes, which gives the state a little bit more leeway in deciding where to allocate those funds.
I can see how that could lead to some interesting power dynamics, maybe with the central government kind of using those grants as leverage to influence state-level policies.
Oh, absolutely.
But let's put that aside for a second. Think about the state itself. How does all of this money, whether it's from taxes, grants, how does that actually impact the decisions of that Council of Ministers?
Well, I mean, for starters, the availability of resources really dictates what they can achieve. A state that has a booming economy, a healthy tax base, they might have more freedom to invest in big-ticket projects, infrastructure, development, education, healthcare, things like that.
They've got more chips to play with.
Exactly. Whereas a state that's facing, financial constraints, they might have to prioritize those very basic needs, maybe even make some tough choices about where to cut back. It's a real balancing act, trying to meet the needs of the people, but working within their financial limitations.
Makes sense. So money talks, even in the world of politics. But it's not just about how much money a state has. It's about how they choose to spend it too, right?
Oh, 100%. And that's where the annual budget comes in.
The budget.
It's not just a boring financial document. It's a battleground.
Oh, I bet.
You've got different departments that are all vying for their share of the pie. They're lobbying for funding for their projects, for their
I
priorities.
bet those budget meetings can get pretty intense.
Oh, absolutely. It's like this high-stakes poker game with each minister trying to get the best hand for their department.
Wow.
And it's not just about the individual departments either. There's a whole political calculus involved.
What do you mean?
Well, the Council of Ministers, they might choose to prioritize spending in certain regions, maybe areas where they need to shore up political support, or they might focus on certain demographic groups trying to appeal to specific voter bases.
So it's not always about what's best for the state as a whole.
Yeah.
There's a political strategy at play here.
There almost always is. The allocation of resources can be a really powerful tool to win favor with voters and to consolidate political power.
This is fascinating, how everything we've talked about, the structure of the council, the power dynamics, public opinion, media, it all kind of ties back into these financial realities in a way.
It's all interconnected. And to really understand the decisions that the Council of Ministers is making, you have to understand that money trail, where it comes from, where it goes, and who benefits.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've gone from, the very basics of the Council of Ministers all the way to the nitty-gritty of state finances. But as we wrap up, what are some key takeaways? What should our listeners be thinking about as they, move forward from this deep dive?
Well, remember that state governments are complex. They operate within this web of formal rules, informal influences, political maneuvering, financial constraints, and it's about seeing the whole picture, understanding those connections.
And for those of you out there who are, prepping for the UPSC, state PSC exams, this deep dive has hopefully given you not just the facts, but a deeper understanding of how this system actually works in practice.
Exactly. Don't just memorize the articles of the Constitution. Think critically about those power dynamics, the competing interests, those financial realities that are shaping decisions at that state level.
Because knowing the rules is one thing, but understanding how the game is actually played, that's quite another.
It is. And on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought to ponder. In a world that's facing all these increasing challenges, climate change, economic uncertainty, social inequality, what are some innovative approaches that state governments can take to really manage their finances effectively and ensure equitable development? It's a big question, but definitely one worth considering as we move forward.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Indian state governments. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those questions flowing.